So we want to come here tonight to talk to you about, we're not going to tell you exactly how to make your app sticky, but we're going to tell you how to measure how sticky your app is and how to take users that have found your app to be sticky and drive more people like that to your app. So yeah, we did this part.
Just as a very brief overview of Flurry, so we have quite a number of products. We have an analytics side of the business and an advertising side of the business, and we're just going to touch on analytics today. So analytics is a free product. We're right now the #1 analytics provider in mobile based on scale. So yesterday we actually reached 500,000 apps using Flurry, which was a huge accomplishment. I think there are about 1 million apps on the market today. Wasn't going for the round, but I appreciate it. And these are some of the companies that are actually using us to track analytics today. So Zynga, eBay, Gap, and we have 155 app developers using us, and we're tracking 1.3 trillion monthly events, so different actions that you can track in an app. So we have an enormous quantity of data, and we're going to go through this at a bit of a micro level today and help you understand how to use your data to drive app stickiness.
So we're going to hit on 3 main topics today. We're going to talk about how to know your data and how to instrument your app in order to collect data. Then we're going to talk about how do you identify your most valuable users based on the data that you're collecting. And once you've done that, how do you measure that you are in fact driving those most valuable users into your app from the various advertising platforms that you might be using. So first we're going to talk about know your data. So there's a few things that you just need to know about your app. You need to know the number of new users you have. You need to know the number of weekly, daily, monthly, yearly active users that you have. You need to know the number of sessions that your app, that your users see on your app on a daily basis. And you want to know what is your retention for users over a given time span. Just by including the Flurry SDK with a couple simple calls, you get all of this out of the box, okay? But whatever analytics solution you're using, this is table stakes right here. This is what you need to know. But further on, that tells you the basic usage of your app, but it doesn't tell you how people are using your app, okay? And in Flurry, we've addressed that with the ability to go in and create custom events. And so you might go in and create an event that says, hey, a user made an in-app purchase, or a user started to make an in-app purchase, because maybe you want to compare those two later on down the road and say, look, 20% of my users got into an in-app purchase that began the transaction, but only 15% completed. Why did that happen? You could do a lot of different things, but you want to take the business logic and your business goals of your app. You want to express them in a set of events that allow you to track what your users are doing within your app, and you want to instrument those events into your app. Now, what could be in an app? Okay, an app in the Flurry system is pretty broad and pretty general. You have the basic event, and then let's say you're watching an episode of Nashville, and then you have parameters that you can add in, and for every event you can add up to 10 parameters. And each parameter can have multiple values that go into that parameter. So you could have, here we're looking at the event was Nashville, the parameter was episode, and let's say it was 1, and the duration was 15 minutes. Okay, that tells you a pretty good insight into what the user did with that particular event. So that some of the things you might want to ask is what are basic events that you might want to track? Well, that's going to be different for every different app. If you're a game, you might want to track, and you probably should track, levels. The event name could be level play. The trigger could be whenever a level loads. And what things are you going to collect as parameters? Where you're going to collect the level play, the level started, whether the level was started, whether the level was restarted. You might even want to collect duration in that one, because you can collect timed events so that you know exactly how long it's taking people to complete your level. For navigation, so let's say that you've got a tutorial in your app that shows your users how to use your app. you might want to record what tutorials steps people get to. What happens if it turns out that, hey, everybody falls out at step 3 and there's a 5-step process? Well, that's really valuable information. So, the trigger is the user completes a tutorial step, and the parameters that you might want to pick up are the step that they were on, as well as the duration that they spent on that step. Monetization, if your monetization strategy is in-app purchases, you want to watch in-app purchases very closely. And so you should have stages within the in-app purchase lifecycle that tell you when somebody started it, when somebody gets into the middle of it, and when somebody ends it. And you can, just with 3 events like that, you could actually start tracking, okay, look, we may or may not have a problem with how we're presenting in-app purchases. And social, maybe you want to know how many times someone shares your app on Facebook. You create an event named Facebook Share. The trigger is whenever anybody decides to share Facebook, and the parameters could be what they were sharing. Maybe it's a score and a level, or maybe it's something they decided they want to buy. But events can mean a lot to you and your app, and it's very important that you instrument them correctly. So that brings us to, real quick, what does implementation entail? So, some of you are developers, some of you are PMs, some of you are, other things. If you are going to ask your developers to sit down and implement an SDK, how long does it take them? So it turns out that the basic implementation for Flurry takes around 5 minutes. And that gets you what we were talking about at the beginning, the table stakes. You get active users, daily users, new users, sessions, things like that. And it basically, you put in a call to start session. As soon as the app launches, it sends up a signal to the Flurry servers, and the basic information is recorded right then. So iOS, the basic integration is an application did finish launching with options. You put in this call to start session along with your API key. API key is provided to you from the dev portal, and then you return, and that's your basic iOS integration. What does an iOS events integration look like? Well, it turns out that you create an NS dictionary object, basically just string pairs. You can have up to 10 params, and these are what your params are. And you pass that dictionary into a log event call, and that's all you have to do. On Android, because of the activity structure of Android and the activity lifecycle, it's actually a little bit more. It's not complex, but you have to do a little bit more. So in Android, for every activity's onStart method, you need to make a call to Flurry agent onStart session with the API key. And for every activity's onStop lifecycle method, you need to make a call to the onEnd session. For events, it's just as simple as iOS. You create a map, you pass that map into your log event call, and away you go. So now I'm going to turn it over to Alex, and she's going to talk about how you identify your most valuable users.
Yeah. Question?
Sure.
What about if you're doing a hybrid native approach like Cordova or something like that?
What do you mean?
If you're using a hybrid native container for
so
like
right.
Cordova framework?
So typically we don't actually develop any. We don't actually develop any adapters, but there's a lot of adapters that are out on the web that people have developed in advance. So we've got Unity adapters, we've got MonoTouch adapters, we've got quite a few. I don't know about Cordova specifically, but we can check it out at the end of the talk, and I'll tell you what I think. Any other questions? Great.
All right. So part of app stickiness is really identifying who are the users that care about what you're developing and getting them into the app and getting them engaged versus trying to get everyone in the world interested in the product that you're developing. And at Flurry, we look at this in 2 ways. So how to identify your most valuable users is really a matter of understanding the segments of users and what characteristics they have and why they find your app appealing, and also looking at it through the persona lens. So in Flurry, we've actually pre-labeled certain audience segments that aren't manual segments that you can build, and they're things like new moms or travel enthusiasts, and we've already determined what those groups are. And once you know who are the groups that are excited about your app, and you figure out how to attract them, that's a very good way to make your app sticky and make people loyal. So the first thing I just wanted to cover was segments. So within Flurry, you can segment users basically any way you'd like. So for example, the 3 most common segments we see are paying versus non-paying customers. And that's determined off of an event, as Mike just described. So you would have an in-app payment event and just create a segment based on that. You can have casual versus power users. So basically, we have a scale that you can set to define what is a power user in my app. Do they use my app 5 times a day or more, 5 times a month or more, versus casual or infrequent users. And you could also build a segment of men versus women, or age or anything else. And basically, you can view all of the different mobile metrics, all the basic metrics that Mike walked through by these different segments to see how the different segments are engaging in your app. You can also use this information to plan an acquisition campaign or package a group of your users to sell to an advertising audience. And so we've outlined here all the different ways that you can create segments in Flurry. So as I mentioned, usage level and events and demographics we've already walked through. You can also have a cohort based on the time in which they started using your app. So you know users acquired in November of 2013 happen to be a very loyal cohort or a very highly engaged cohort. And you can also have a segment based on acquisition source. So you can determine in Flurry, whether users acquired via email campaign or users that came in a particular network campaign are actually more sticky and like your app more, and then put more money behind acquiring those.
How do you trace the source?
Yeah, so we actually have a feature built into Flurry called User Acquisition Analytics, and what we'll do is we'll provide for each campaign a click-through link that you can use to then track clicks and installs. So other than segments, the next group is personas, and so in Flurry we've categorized a group of 40 or 50 different personas that tend to be interesting to advertisers and also across our app. So we have 500,000 apps, and we're trying to think, okay, what are the segments that people like to target and that people want to really know about? Here are some of them. They're categorized into different groups. And basically the way that a particular user or device gets put into a segment is they have to be a whale user of apps in that category. So for example, for the business traveler persona, for example, we'll look at what basket of apps do they have on their phone. Are they using Delta, Kayak, JetBlue, SPG? These obviously aren't Flurry customers because I can't name them all in front of a group, but those are the types of apps that they would use. And then, are they a recent heavy user? So do they spend 25 times more time in that basket of apps than the average mobile user? And if they do, they're in that group. The interesting thing about these personas is that we update the membership bi-weekly. So I could be a business traveler this week because I'm here from New York, and I'm staying in a hotel and I'm expensing things and I'm using all of these different travel apps, and then in 2 weeks I'll be back in New York and I won't be in the category anymore because I'm no longer actively using these apps. And so, in sum on personas, once you've integrated the Flurry SDK, you can see what percentage of your entire user base fits into each of those personas. And if you're looking at your app and you see 75% of our users are mobile shoppers, 25% are this, 15% are that, you'll know the different groups that are actively engaged in your app, and you'll know, I should be tailoring features of my app to this particular audience to drive engagement going forward.
Any questions?
Yeah, about personas, how do you figure out what other apps that user has installed? And if you're asking for app permission and you're looking at the number of apps that are activated, does that mean that including Flurry in my app will increase the number of permissions I ask from my users?
Sure. So the question is if we're looking back at the personas and we're able to look across a broad category of apps and track, this user has opened this type of app multiple times. How do we do that? And if we do that, do you as the app developer have to include extra permissions in order to gain that information? So let me address the first one first. We have a reach of around 500,000 apps. We see 1.2 billion devices a month. We see 5 billion sessions a day. We have a very broad reach, and we have the ability to see you in one app, and the next app, and the next app, and the next app, assuming that those apps are Flurry users. And so that's how we do the first thing. With regards to the, do you need any extra permissions? Not necessarily, no. On Android, definitely not. On iOS, it just depends on whether or not you include the advertising framework. But in general, it doesn't show any extra permission that the user has to accept. So.
Was there one other question?
Oh. Okay.
All right.
So now we're going to talk about how do you measure success. So with analytics, you've started to gather data. You've started to segment your users, and you think that you've identified a group of users that are big spenders, or these are people that are monetizing well for you. So how do you start driving those people into your app in greater numbers? So Flurry provides a product called User Acquisition Analytics. It's basically like a third-party tracker, similar to a HasOffers or a Kachava, anybody like that. But the advantage is that you also get the reach of Flurry to go along with it. So what you would do is when you were setting up an acquisition campaign on a millennial or a Flurry or maybe an email campaign or a Skype campaign, Twitter campaign, you create a campaign in User Acquisition Analytics. We provide you a click-through URL that the user is going to click. The user clicks that, they install the app, Flurry sees the install as soon as the app is launched, and then we start checking in the background to see who that install belongs to, who had the last click. And once we've determined that, we give that install to that channel. Now the interesting thing about Flurry that not a lot of the other third-party trackers are doing right now is we allow you to identify a quality metric, okay? And so the quality metric in this instance would be the segment of users that you've identified as people that you can heavily monetize. Okay, so you might have a jump tap and a millennial and a web and an email campaign and maybe an AdMob AdWords campaign. And you can see that the install percentage, the conversion rates are around 2.3%. But if you look right here, you can see that jump tap is delivering many more quality users than the other networks. So maybe you want to start spending your money a little more heavily on the jump tap side, since they're able to drive the quality users into your app in much greater percentages. The web right here, Serious Sparrows, it has a lower conversion rate, but the quality percent conversion is actually 3.2%. So for every conversion there, you're actually able to drive a heavily monetizable individual into your app. So maybe you also want to spend some time on the web as well. So this is just the life cycle that it goes through. You set up each campaign, and each campaign provides you a click-through URL that you're going to hand off to your third party or your advertising network or your campaign. That URL drives them through Flurry back over to the App Store. The user installs. As soon as they launch, Flurry records the app launch, and we say, hey, we've got a new user. Then we start the matching machinery on the background. We say, okay, yes, I have a click for this device, and look, the last click for that device comes from Jump Tap. So we're going to attribute that to Jump Tap, and then we report on it, and the reporting is available within 2 hours. I'm going to turn back over to Alex now.
Okay, cool. So this is the visual depiction of a feature we have called a funnel, which is basically the conversion along a series of steps that you care about in your app. And this is another tool to measure success. So it's not only about measuring stickiness of your users and whether they come back to the app, but also whether they're converting along the paths that you care about while they're in your app. And so what you see here is a hotel ad. The menu is served for the hotel saying, hey, do you want to book a hotel? The next step is an event where somebody is actually clicking on a particular hotel. The next one is whether they enter their payment info to book a hotel room, and the final one is that they've received the confirmation that they've booked the room. And so you can see, this is an example of a funnel that you could set up in Flurry, where you see the percentage of users that go through this path and what the fallout is along the path. So for example, you know, so whoever is working on this app might say, okay, you know, why did 20% confirm their payment information but only 17% ended up booking? Do we have a glitch in the app? Is it moving too slowly? Do people get booted out? What exactly is going on there? So, you know, to lose conversion at an important point in our app. And this is another tool that you can use to understand different segments of users. So when you're trying to figure out who do we actually want to keep in this app, who's our audience? Well, you know, do men or women convert along this path better? That's how you should pick based on the data.
Can you do A/B testing eventually, or that breaks Apple's rules?
I'll
Okay.
take it.
A/B testing is something we want to do, but there's a lot of other things that we need to do in advance of that. So it's definitely something that's on our roadmap, but it doesn't have a date specified for it yet. So.
But you could use something like Optimizely, right? And then create your own Flurry events and track your Optimizely.
Sure. Yeah, you could definitely do that. Go ahead. I haven't seen any direct comparisons. You know, I think if you're in control of the click, and especially if it's a device identifier attribution, it's going to be in the high 90s, very, very close to 100%. When you fall back to algorithmic attribution, you know, there's always differences in how people do that attribution. And so under certain circumstances, you know, has offers might be a little bit better than us, but on other circumstances, we might be better than has offers. But, you know, the long and short of it is that we haven't done a direct comparison. But I would imagine that, especially considering that most everybody does device ID attribution, it's comparable. Questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have like 2 questions / suggestions, ideas.
Sure.
So the first one is, with all the data you have, you can actually make kind of rating of all the different acquisition sources. So of course they are different, like for different categories of apps and so on, or different apps, but still you can kind of aggregate the data and produce kind of meaningful report which can be used for your PR. So this is something I would like to use and to see as an app owner, just to, you know, have like top 10 acquisition sources that are being used in this category. And the second question / idea is, the question was, maybe you have this data, so maybe you can right now tell, like, so we are seeing that these 5 sources are the most interesting, well performing.
I don't believe we've compiled
No,
that.
I don't think we have compiled it.
The reason that we haven't compiled it is because we're trying to be a channel agnostic product. So we also have a network, and we're competing against all of these guys in that chart too. So we're not looking at it in aggregate. We're just trying to provide the product.
Okay. And well, the second is a bit similar, but it would be really interesting to see kind of benchmark conversion rates and different kind of obvious use cases for an app. For example, how many people do convert from the front page to the sign in with Facebook, for example, or other things like that.
Cross app.
So have you thought about it, making some report?
We do some benchmarking against your category on the general analytics front. So you can go in and see what is your benchmark of active users compared to other people that have an app in your category. So if you're a game of a certain type, you can see, well, look, I'm trending above the typical benchmark, so I'm doing good. The problem with benchmarking against something like an event is that that event really only makes sense to you, right? So I would have to figure out, okay, to you, this is what my Facebook conversion event looks like. And to him, his Facebook conversion event looks this way. And what happens if you're not capturing the same amount of parameters?
Yeah.
So it tends to become a pretty unstructured data query.
For sure. So
which
that
is a little more difficult to deal with.
Yeah, that would require you just to email individual app owners and ask them what are your top
what happens if
conversions.
this guy right here completely freaks out because he doesn't want his data included in that query. And,
Of course,
yeah, it gets a little sticky at that
Sure.
point. So,
Yeah, got it. Thanks.
any other questions? And there will be time afterwards for more questions, but go ahead.
Yeah, so I looked at your SDK maybe a year or two ago,
Sure.
and it seemed that you guys were tracking the sessions based on when the app was backgrounded
Yep.
on iOS.
Mhm.
Our app is actually used extensively in the background because
Okay.
it plays playlists.
Yeah.
Do you guys have a way to track to modify how you measure the
Sure.
sessions?
So we do have a few ways to do that. Number one, you can turn off that end of, so the way the session works, okay, the session model is that the session starts as soon as the app is brought to the foreground. And at that point, we send off a report that says, hey, a session started, and here's who it started for. If there's any existing data that we haven't sent yet, we'll send it then, okay? The user starts using the app, and typically when the app gets backgrounded, we will wait 5 to 10 seconds and send off another report that says, the app has been backgrounded, this is the information that I've captured, and these are my events, and here it is, okay? But we won't actually end that session until the app comes back to the foreground again, because if you can set a session timeout, so let's say that you expect that users are going to be out of your app for a minute to do something, you can say don't end the session for a minute. As soon as they come back in, we check that timer. If it's been less than a minute, we don't end the session. We just continue it. Now, when you go into the background, like you said, with the new changes to iOS, and I think it was iOS 6, you can start doing things in the background. And so we gave a control that says, hey, I'm going to the background, but don't end the session. Don't report now. Just go to the background gracefully, okay? And then in iOS 7, they introduced the ability that, oh yeah, you can be called from the background to do some kind of task. And what we recommend in that instance is that you check the source, whether or not you're coming from the background and whether or not you're in the foreground. And I can find some code that shows you how to do that. And if you are in the background and it's a situation where you don't want to record a session, then you can just not call start session at that point. So, but I've got some code somewhere I can show it to you.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm curious. So I'm sure you have some kind of tricked out version of Flurry for Flurry. Let's call it Meta Flurry, right? Where you actually track your own success as a business and your customers. I'm curious what kind of, what's the most surprising insight you got from your own data and how people were using Flurry, and what have you changed as a result?
I would say for me, it's the fact that one of the most heavily monetizable personas are the moms from the age of like 25 to 34. That if you can capture that audience, and if you can get them in your app, they drive an incredible amount of spend through your app. Yeah.
I mean, the most surprising thing to me is that a lot of folks aren't using the full suite of features. So everything in the product is free, and you can build segments, and you can build funnels, and you can track user acquisition. And there's a lot of just putting in the SDK and then kind of checking it once a month. Whereas the goal for all of this is to really drive actionable insights. And there are some customers that we work hand in hand with to drive those insights and then actually drive results in their business. We hope that people will start to engage more and more with all the features, because we see what percentage of the features are being used by which types of groups, and we're really trying to get the message out there that some of these things can actually drive real revenue impact to your businesses.
Hold on just 1 second. How are we doing on time?
How like 10 minutes?
Okay.
Okay, cool.
How about I'll come back to you in just a sec. Let's power through the rest of the slides, and then we'll
I think we have one slide left.
Okay.
Is that right?
2. Yeah, 2.
Okay.
We're good.
Okay, so the final slide where we're going to just throw a bunch of data at you is the are the users retained slide. So I think this is the real kind of aha data for app stickiness. Are you retaining your users? And so in Flurry, we have a number of different ways that you can actually track retention. The one that you see up here is called return rate. This is a feature that we introduced a couple of weeks ago publicly, and it basically is static retention. So what you see here is all of the users along the x-axis are delineated by install month, so whatever month they installed your app, and you can compare the percent returning on month 7 after install to month 3 after install, and you can look at this in daily, weekly, or monthly view to understand how am I retaining users based on when they were acquired. We also have 2 other retention metrics that are quite interesting. One is rolling retention or life cycle, which will just enable you to measure churn, so you can understand, okay, if all the users that are acquired on day 0, on day 7, what percentage of them are still using my app? On day 29, what percentage are still using my app? And slice and dice that data by the segments you created. Does this differ by men versus women, by purchasers versus non, by people who get to level 3 versus those who don't? And then finally, the third retention metric is called recent users, and that metric enables you to see what percentage of users acquired in a given day, week, or month are using the app this week. So you can see, okay, of all the users acquired in May 2013, when we ran a huge marketing campaign or introduced a new feature or made a change in the app that we thought would increase app stickiness, what percentage of them are still using the app this week versus those that were acquired a year earlier when we didn't introduce a feature that we thought would drive up stickiness.
So some concluding thoughts. I see this mistake time after time after time. Somebody says, hey, I'm about to launch my app. I'm going to submit to the App Store in 6 hours, and I really want to know how to track my data. And I'm dead serious. It happens all the time. Can you guys help me do that? And I'm like, well, here's all my docs. Go through the docs. You're like, but it'll take me longer than 6 hours to go through that. I'm like, no, it won't, but do it anyways. You really need to be thinking about that early. When you're developing your app, before it hits the market, you need to have analytics of some sort in so that you can measure things. Once you have those analytics in, you need to get to a point where you know your most valuable users. And once you can identify your most valuable users, you need to drive those users into your app. And then the last thing is constantly reassess, constantly address it. Make sure that you're going back. Every new feature you add, implement it with events. Do everything that you need to do on a regular basis. And now we can talk, break for questions. All right. Let me get to this gentleman here. He had one.
Oh, I was going to ask about the change in the metric of the daily active users, but I think you addressed that.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
The recent users tab, you have so-called secret average, which means like how is your app performing compared to other apps within the same category. So my question is, what is the rule of apps that you include in this average? Like all the apps that use Flurry in this category?
It's the apps that use Flurry that are self-identified as that particular category of app. And I'm pretty sure that we pulled that category list from Apple or the Google Play Store, and that's the list you select from. It's one of the first steps you have to do when you create the app.
Yeah, my question is more like how should I realize this data? I mean, in terms of like my app success, because a lot of the apps on the App Store have that completely.
Right.
You know, the average probably is far below that I should expect.
Sure.
Yeah. So those will be kind of underweighted in the data. So we provide benchmarks for 4 metrics. We have session length, frequency of use, what are the other 2? Rolling retention and recent users. And you can see relative to any App Store category your metric. So for example, like for session length, any app that's used a ton will be captured as a high percentage of that group, so it really should be weighted accurately to your comparison set.
Thank you. I see the retention feature is in beta version. What kind of plan do you have for it? Like what kind of changes you plan to do and to finalize it?
Oh, why is it in beta?
Yeah, why is it in beta and what changes you will do before finalizing it?
I actually don't know the next steps on the roadmap, to be honest.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that for you. Typically, what we'll do is we'll put something out in beta. It'll stay that way while we collect feedback, and consumer feedback comes in, and we address it and assess it. And at that point, we might make changes. But I would hazard to guess that there's not anything significant that will change on it in the near future. So, go ahead.
So, is there any limitation on the cable for events?
Yes.
And also, when I used the system, I think it's been like 6 or 7 months now.
Okay.
It was really difficult to actually filter by events or what you guys can put in. You kind of expand and then it's up.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. You can have up to 1,000 events in a session, and that spans the entire size of the session. So if your session is a few minutes, that's probably not going to be a problem. As far as the interface for dealing with events, it definitely could use a little updating, but I think you can still get a lot of valuable information out of it. So.
What about the
I'm sorry. Hold on. Let me come closer. You can put in 10 parameters.
10 parameters.
Yep, 10 parameters.
Of string values.
Yeah, it has to be string values. We're actually changing the SDK to scream nice and loud if you put something in other than a string. But yeah, 10 string values are what you get per event call.
And you can have 300 events per app.
Yes. You can have up to 300 events total within the entire app, and 1,000 events total within a session. Okay.
Yeah, and
So.
there's a tool under Manage. There's an event section, and typically we will say use the hide events feature or filter events.
Yeah.
So let's say you've instrumented 300 events, but really 15 of them are the ones that you care about. The easiest way to do it is to just hide it all from yourself, and then have it be a more organized set that you're working with, and unhide them as you need them.
Yeah. And one thing, if you decide that you don't like an event, don't delete it. This is another thing we see in our parlance. A deleted event doesn't mean, hey, I'm going to get rid of that event's data now, and I'll just start collecting it again. It says, I'm going to take this event, I'm going to turn it into a black hole, and anything that comes into it is just going to get thrown out the window. So don't delete events unless you really know that you don't want them. So, great.
So this might be kind of a naive question. If you have an app that relies on affiliate revenues, and we are sending our users to another app that's covered by Flurry, is there any kind of integration for an event like making a purchase in another app that you guys are covered by? Is there any, not to get the money, just the data of
Sure.
I sent somebody here,
Sure.
did they buy something like that?
At the moment, no.
Unless you own the other app.
Yeah, unless you own the other app, you can track that.
You know,
Yeah, okay. At the moment, no, we don't have a feature like that, unfortunately. So,
Yeah, going back to the gentleman's question about Flurry personas.
sure.
So would all of the apps that you guys are doing, they would all have to have Flurry as the right? To capture the probability.
Yes. Yeah. The persona data is something we provide to the app when it has the SDK in it, but we're not able to make as much sense of the data if the SDK is not there. So obviously,
No, I'm saying for the other apps. Right?
oh, for the other apps, so
From what I understand correctly, of what Flurry
Ah,
personas are,
okay,
I'm not being misunderstood.
no,
So I can track what bundle of users are using my app and the rest of the apps on my phone, right?
yeah. So personas are built out of other apps that have the Flurry SDK in it. Yeah. So okay, go ahead.
Two more questions.
Okay, 2 more questions then. Gentleman in the red.
So it looks like there are a couple of third-party apps and widgets that allow you to get your Flurry information on your mobile device. How come there's no actual official Flurry application?
That's a great question and one I get asked on occasion. I don't have a solid and satisfiable answer for you. So I would say be very careful with the third-party apps that are getting your data. because they are now in control of your API access code and your API key, which means that if they wanted to do something nefarious to your account, they could possibly do that. So, all right, last question. Gentleman in the orange.
We use Flurry for about a year. And,
Okay.
we have a lot of brands, and the problem that because of the bug, the problem that we in development, we kind of messed up with some of them. It would way to raw data in the app, so to get the full scale brand. I know it's sometimes.
So let me reinterpret your question. You've
Just
used.
a simple question. Is there a business plan to make access to raw data? Or how? And
Like
What-
raw data API or
raw data that you store about.
Sure. We do have an API that allows you to get event level information. It only goes back a month. And it at this point is not necessarily open to the general populace, but if you want to come talk to me later, we can talk about it. When it comes to your actual like sessions and the number of active users you have, the number of new users, we do have APIs that provide that information, which are generally available to the populace. So I can point you in those directions. Is that what you're looking for?
But I can only get it if I cannot edit it if I know that.
No. The data when it gets in, so like the raw data as it exists in our system, there's no way to get access to that data, specifically because once an agent report hits our servers, it basically gets exploded into 1,000 little pieces and goes and lives in a lot of different places. And the process of reassembling that back into something that you could make sense of would be very prohibitive and probably not something that we could do very easily. So, great. I think we're out of time. Thank you all.
Thank you.